So first of all, my name is Lester Spence. I'm sorry I'm not able to see you all and have this conversation with you in person. I think for intellectual and political reasons, having a discussion about Do the Right Thing as 30-year anniversary, I think is important. I want to thank Dean Hollis Robbins for the invitation. I want to thank AJ for your work on this. In the case of Dean Robbins, she's been a really important friend and in many ways a mentor the last few years. And to the extent I've had relative success in what's been trying times over the last few years has been in part because of her wise counsel. So this is what I want to do. Uh, I was 20 years old when Do the Right Thing came out in the movie theater. So I want to talk a little bit about that experience and my experience with Spike Lee's work, kind of as a young college, a young undergrad aged black man. And then what I want to do after that is have kind of a longer, a richer conversation that distinguishes the post civil rights era from the post civil rights era, then situate Do the Right Thing in that post civil rights era moment. The reason I'm not actually able to talk to you in person is because I'd agreed to give a talk at the University of Toronto in honor of Richard Eiton, who passed away several years ago and who was actually a Hopkins PhD and was a University of Toronto faculty. It's actually Richard Eiton who comes up with that post civil rights versus post civil rights differentiation, and then that gives kind of me a handle on thinking about Do the Right Thing as a product of that post civil rights era, but then it also gives me kind of a unique angle on kind of how to think about that in the post civil rights era, right? And to the extent we're still dealing with some of the same challenges, what are the politics of those challenges in a post civil rights era moment? And hopefully I'll be able to do it within about a 12-15 minute time period. One of the blessings of the 21st century is I've got right where my finger is, I am looking to 16, 17, 18. So I should be good. All right, let's go. So 1989, Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing was actually his third movie. And I had seen She's Gotta Have It, I'd seen School Days, and a number of us are looking forward to Do the Right Thing. We remember Do the Right Thing was set in the context of there were a number of problematic police incidents in New York City, and then increasingly like throughout the country. So, for example, Rodney King is the early 90s. So Spike Lee's movie is one of the first movies to tackle this. And in this way, he'd been the first. So School Days was the first major film to be shot kind of around black college politics. And even though I was a undergraduate at the University of Michigan, our black population was large enough to have a lot of those political conflicts. I actually joined a black fraternity a little bit after the year after School Days came out. So I've been familiar with his body of work, and I thought that's a few things I thought. I thought Spike's cinematographer, Ernest Dickerson, was one of the best in the business. The way he kind of used shots and colors, I think, was really vibrant. Spike Lee employed, I believe, Robbie Reed as his casting agent, and I think she did a wonderful job. If you think about characters like Radio Raheem, and the actor Bill Dunn, I think he actually passed away over the last several years. You think about the early work, people like Samuel L. Jackson, who played a minor character in School Days. Her casting was wonderful. I mean, Bugging Out, Giancarlo Esposito, who actually is funny. Giancarlo Esposito is Italian black, so that character is real. That character and the actor playing that role is really really interesting. So I've been familiar with Spike Lee's work, and Spike Lee. This movie, of the first three movies he shot, was viewed as being the most controversial at the time. A number of writers, mostly white, but I think that Stanley Crouch was one of these writers as well, actually argued that what Spike Lee was doing was basically inciting black people to riot. Given the number of police incidents that had happened in Baltimore and elsewhere, and given the subject matter, folks thought that black people were basically just go into the movies and come out kind of wanting to riot. And I remember liking the movie, but I remember the thing that really stood out to me was that I, as a film goer, cared more about Sal's pizzeria being burned down than I cared about Radio Raheem's death. Now, there's an argument that starts to bleed into the post versus post-civil rights era thing, but I'm going to get to that. One potential argument is that the reason I felt that way is because consciously, maybe I wasn't as conscious as other folk. Like the phrase that students would use now is I wasn't as woke as maybe some students were. But on the surface of it, that didn't make sense. I mean, I was in a black fraternity. I was actually involved in a black student union. I was involved in black student politics in Michigan. I grew up in a black neighborhood. My parents are black. All my people are black, etc. Right. What stood out to me when I tried to think about that, because I knew that he, as a film goer, supposedly wanted us to care about Radio Raheem's death. What stood out to me was that we didn't know anything about Radio Raheem. Radio Raheem was a pretty flat character as far as the constructive characters go. We don't know anything about his family. Does he have a family? We don't know whether he has a love interest. We don't know whether he has a job. We don't know how he paid for his radio. We don't know. The only thing we know is that he serves as kind of a certain type of public voice for the neighborhood, a certain type of moral authority for the neighborhood, and that he's a kid. That's the only thing we know. On the other hand, if you think about how Sal and his family is constructed, we know what his hopes and dreams are. We know what his family life is like. Obviously, we actually see an arc with him and, to a lesser extent, his two sons throughout the course of the film. A lot of the film is actually shot in Sal's place, and we see him have different types of interactions with the different types of folk, from the mayor to Mookie's sister to Radio Raheem and Bugging Out. He has a couple of encounters with Bugging Out, to the kids, including a young Martin Lawrence, the actor, who end up being in the pizzeria. He lets them into the pizzeria after hours, which ends up creating the conflict between him and Radio Raheem that ends up blowing everything up, so to speak, right? So we see him do a range of different things, yet and still we end up caring more about, so as a result of that, I end up finding myself as a young viewer caring more about Sal than I did about Radio Raheem. And that was the thing that really stuck with me. Oh, another thing, Spike's dad, I think, did the film score, and Spike's scores have always been wonderful. The soundtrack was wonderful as well. So Spike was one of the first people. He not only was the first kind of black director of the modern era, he's also one of the first directors, I think, of any genre to really understand how to bring together a soundtrack and a score to really tell a picture, to tell a story, at least in as far as kind of regular motion pictures go, right? Wow, already 9 minutes. So what do I think about it now? So first, the post civil rights era. So the post civil rights era extends from approximately 1968 or so, with the death of Martin Luther King, the assassination of Martin Luther King, to around 1991, 1992 or so, right? What characterizes this wave is we see a significant increase in black elected officials. We see, we see a number of metropolitan areas become significantly black. We see a number of cities become majority black as a partial byproduct of white flight and white corporate flight. We see a number of changes in the political economy. We see diminished union membership. We see diminished importance of the manufacturing sector. We see increased importance of financial, insurance, and real estate sector, the fire sector. We also see a significant increase in incarceration. We see a decrease in the ability of cities to collect taxes, right? All what I call kind of the beginnings of the neoliberal turn. What separates the post-civil rights era from that moment is that whereas in that first moment you see a number of black elected officials who are ideologically on the left, who may, in the case of black mayors, be forced to move to the right, but they're still kind of ideologically liberal to the left. After this moment, we actually see the election of a number of black mayors with limited civil rights background, who come from the corporate sector, more with that corporate type of mentality. They are center to center right. They believe in reduction of taxes. They believe in using the city as a space for downtown development. They believe in drawing corporations and white middle-income families back in. They believe less in the politics of redistribution unless that redistribution is upwards. As far as the mass media, the really important dynamic, 11:30, still got a little bit of time. The most important dynamic of the mass media is there's this moment when with Do the Right Thing, even though Do the Right Thing kind of breaks that, where black popular culture is really created for black consumers, right? If you have a black song, you're listening to it, unless you're somebody like a Michael Jackson or a Prince, you're listening to it on black radio stations. If you're, black television really didn't exist all that much except for the Cosby Show. You did have BET, but the only people consuming BET were black people. As a result of SoundScan, really quickly, what SoundScan does is it's a dynamic which allows music producers to get point of sale information about who's consuming their stuff. So as before that moment, you actually see TV, music producers, et cetera, using like Nielsen ratings, like indirectly garnering people's preferences, right? As a result of SoundScan, people are, as soon as somebody buys a CD at the record store, that's actually counted, right? So what happens as a result of that? What happens as a result of that, the first week that it was out, people realized that the most important genre in the United States as far as music sales was actually gangster rap. NWA's second album, Ethel for Zaggin', that's not really, you spell the title backwards and you get really what it really was. That was the #1 album in the United States, and nobody thought that was really possible. People just thought that gangster rap was something that was only consumed by black people. So what that moment does is basically create the conditions for kind of a super public, where now we have black popular culture routinely consumed by whites, right? So Black Panther was ostensibly created for black people, by black people, but there's a reason that it makes more money than any other popular film, including Avengers Infinity War over 2018, right? So that's kind of the post-civil rights era. Oh, of course, we have the election of not just black mayor, we have the election of the first card-carrying black president, and we have the election of more than one. Kamala Harris is a senator. Cory Booker is a senator. Carol Moseley Brown, I think, was elected at the kind of the beginning of the post-civil rights era, right? So what we've got is this dynamic in which we have that the union membership stuff, all the stuff I talked about, union membership, white flight, corporate flight, a lot of stuff, that stuff is crystallized. We also have a dynamic where people no longer believe government should do much, including black elected officials. We also have a dynamic in which the black American kind of idea is really around the United States instead of kind of a diaspora, right? And then we have this dynamic where black popular culture is kind of out there. All right, I'm about to hit 15 minutes. So what do I think about Do the Right Thing now in this moment looking back. The thing that looks back. So first thing, the Radio Raheem thing. I am now a parent. Back then I was 20 years old. Now I'm 50. Having seen do the right thing, I now do have an emotional content or emotional feeling when I see Radio Raheem murdered. I think part of that may actually be my transition into parenthood, where I have 3 boys, and I can now kind of layer in to Radio Raheem all the stuff that Spike didn't talk about, right? I think what I didn't catch at the time was how much Spike Lee had captured a certain type of black variance, right? So I study black politics, and what I mean when I think about black politics, when I study it, is I study kind of the differences within black populations that then produce and or are produced by the fact that you have some black folk, like Spike Lee himself, who have a lot of money, some black folk who have a little bit of money, and then a whole bunch of black folk who are broke, right? So one of the things that kind of structures that, or is structured by that, is black ideological variance, right? So in Do the Right Thing, Spike does a really powerful job of capturing kind of black nationalist sentiment of a certain type. He does a really, really good job of kind of garnering some kind of integrationist sentiment, right? He does kind of a good job of kind of. It's funny because one of the things that happens in the middle years of the civil rights movement, the post-civil rights era, is that black radicalism is basically neutered. It's neutered by a combination of black people actually attaining office and state action against black radicals. And as a result, black radical thought exists, but it's kind of incoherent as far as mass publics. So one way to read somebody like Buggin' Out's character is kind of as a black radical, but he's not really all that radical. So you do have differences on black nationalists versus not. You have differences on whether people should, for example, boycott or not. You have actually elements of a certain type of old school black conservatism. There's an encounter between the mayor and one of the teenagers that's really telling, where the mayor, who's really there are 3 moral figures. There's the mayor, there's Sister Mother, and then there's Radio Raheem, where the mayor has an encounter with one of the teenagers, and the teenager goes in on the mayor because the mayor's always drunk. And he talks about how what he should be doing is getting a job. Like, he has no respect for the mayor because he doesn't have a job. He doesn't have a stable income, right? So if you think about that type of variance, right, you've got that, right? You've actually got even a certain extent, you've got interesting black family dynamics, in that we know Mookie has a sister, and we know he has a kid, but we never see Mookie's parents, right? In fact, we don't see a single quote-unquote stable, full black family, as in the mother, the father, they're married with the kids. I don't think the only one, there's an intimated one in there where the mayor saves a kid's life, and I know I'm going over time. I swear to God, I'm going to finish soon. The mayor saves a kid's life. That kid has a mom and a dad at home. I think that might be the only family. But so we've got these differences in families, right? So he's does a good job of capturing that variance. But what he doesn't capture is income variance at all, right? And in this way, this is when kind of the politics of the post-civil rights era ends up bleeding into the post-civil rights era, right? And as much as hanging over black populations since 1970 and even before it is arguably the most important document that we have to deal with in black politics, may actually be the Moynihan Report. The Moynihan Report, written by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who ends up becoming a senator in New York, actually argues that one of the biggest challenges black people face is that our families are culturally dysfunctional in as much as they don't adhere to the norm, right? So in a way, what you see, and it's that fact that generates poverty outside of racism. And even if we solved racism, black people would still have a problem because of that family dynamic. What we see in Do the Right Thing is, on the one hand, a kind of a quasi response to that, in as much as he's showing that it's possible for all these different folk to actually have families, even though they're not family. Like we see Mookie want to take care of his kid, even though in a number of ways he's random and trifling, right? But at the same time, Spike ends up bleeding out all of the class variants, right? And this is not just something, and this is something he had to create. So what he did in order to make that neighborhood look like that neighborhood was he had to remove all the crack vials. He had to remove all the homeless folk, all elements that looked like that people who were broke or in a bad way or were on drugs or were addicted, all the stuff, or were homeless, all the elements of that black life, Spike erased. All the elements of the black folk with loot, Spike erased. Right? Now, on the one hand, he did, part of the post and the post civil rights era, I'm thinking about Obama's My Brother's Keeper project, is to kind of sort of articulate black people in this certain way to make them look respectable, to then be able to make better claims for citizenship, right? But what that does is that ends up doubling down on the idea that A, black people kind of only really should look one way, B, it doubles down on the solutions, right? So if the problem that we're facing is not systemic state disinvestment, but the fact that black people don't own their own stuff, then the natural solution is black people kind of owning a business, right? And you can see that particular solution is a solution that really fits for that particular class that Spike's trying to articulate. And then along those lines, and on this note, I'm out because I'm already several minutes over, and I apologize for that. But it also kind of gets at the erasure of black radicalism, right? Because what he's done is he's confined all the, he's narrowed black politics down, where even as we have an instance of state violence that generates the rebellion, what we have is no articulation of any type of radical solution that involves the state figuring out how to create a public, right? Nothing like that. So on that note, I'm out. Funny thing is funny. I there's a comment in there about Trump, and there are a couple of characters who walk around reading the Black Panther like the whole time, and given this modern day moment, it's like in some ways Spike was prophetic. So yeah. On that note, thank you again. I'm sorry I'm not there in person, and I hope this is helpful for you, and I actually hope to see you all soon. Peace.